Turn to your neighbor and say, today is about hope. Now, if you don't remember anything I say, remember what your neighbor just preached to you about. Advent is the one season of the Christian liturgical year in which being willfully ignorant is a welcome posture for truly understanding its power. You say, Pastor, why should we be willfully ignorant? Well, in a word, we already know too much. After all your life, we've been celebrating Christmas. And if you've been in anybody's church, you've been celebrating the birth of the Christ child. So, because we know all of that, Advent wants us to be willfully ignorant. Because we are invited to wait expectantly for God's arrival. And yet, our history and the tradition of our faith tells us that God, in a reckless display of extravagant love, dwelled among us in the person of Jesus Christ. Dwelled among us in the person of a peasant rabbi. And breaking into history and transforming the world such that even now, all these many years later, all across the world, the name of Jesus remains on our tongues in praise. So while we embrace God's act of incarnation, we also know that God's work of restoration and redemption is not complete. Jesus was here, but we act like he wasn't. So the world remains broken, divided, violent, oppressive, moving along as if there has been no light, as if there is no light. And so we, as a product of this time, we live in an in-between time. We are saying yes to God. Yes to God with us, while asking God to come again. Against all odds, we in the face of war and hatred, in the face of suffering, of all the things that are wrong, we have hope that God will come and make things right. We hope even when all of the available evidence suggests that to do so is futile and ridiculous. All that is going on around us that indicate that peace and justice and abundance, they're just pipe dreams, Pastor. All the evidence that it's not possible. Nothing like that is even on the horizon. And because we know the experience of God with us, we still live in hope. We live in hope that the world will bend toward God's dream or bend towards justice. We hope that it'll all be all right. And guess what? I'm sorry to tell you, it makes no sense. All us Christian folk having all this hope. It makes no sense. Hope is both a gift and a burden. It's a gift because we focus on that long desired possibility that God has promised, love, of peace. And it's a burden because we know how far away we are from that world. But the prophet Isaiah gives voice to a hope that seems futile and ridiculous in light of his prophetic purpose. You see, Isaiah was commissioned to come and bear witness to Israel. Isaiah had to prophesy to Israel about her sinfulness. Isaiah had to tell these willfully disobedient kings, Ahaz and Hezekiah, that their behavior was not pleasing to God. That because of their sinfulness, because they weren't doing what they were supposed to do, that exile and destruction was coming. That was Isaiah's job. Not a good job, but that was his job. to tell them that you're going to be destroyed. But before Jerusalem is sacked, before the temple is razed, before the chosen people of God are deported to Babylon, before Israel loses everything, here in our text, in the beginning of Isaiah's prophecies, Isaiah relays to them a hopeful vision. Even before things got so horrible, he prophesies a hopeful vision. Now, I want to make it clear to you, prophets, now I know this, we have to tell you this every time. Prophets do not predict. This is not a prediction. Prophets bear witness. Prophets tell us what could be if we take God seriously. And so in this vision of what it would look like if Israel took God seriously is a beautiful, hopeful vision. He speaks of a day when God's house will be on the highest mountain. And what that now there aren't that many mountains in the ancient Near East, but what that means is that God's place, God's presence, it will be an irresistible source of love and light. It will be a destination for all peoples. Nations will stream to it, and all the people will go there. And they will go there to learn from God. And as one unified, gathered body, every part of creation will hear the instruction of God and walk in God's path. Oh, this vision is beautiful. Here it goes even further. There will be such love, peace, and unity that the conflicts between nations and peoples will be resolved. Will be resolved by God's very presence and by God's character as a righteous judge. And here's where that dream starts to get real out of control. There will no longer be instruments of war. Oh, wow. There will no longer be weapons. As a matter of fact, the weapons that you do own will now be used for nourishment, to cultivate crops, so that we can feed everybody. Oh, Isaiah, what are you smoking? What you do? This prophecy does not make sense. It does not make sense. The reality on the ground does not suggest that this is going to happen. The kings are involved in international intrigue. The powerful nations of Assyria and Babylon are surrounding Israel, threatening them all the time. Israel herself is forgetting God. The people are falling away from God's teaching. And yet Isaiah has the temerity before it all falls apart to say, oh, but a time is coming where we will all be hanging out with God. And everybody would love it. And we won't even make war. It's going to be a wonderful, wonderful thing. There is nothing that is going on that suggests that this is going to happen. And yet Isaiah offers a hopeful portrait of the time to come. You see, what this prophet is doing is recognizing the possibilities that God's promises and God's character holds out for us. His hope does not lie in a prediction of a certain future. No, that's not what he's saying. Rather, Isaiah's hope is born of trust in God and in God's character. Isaiah's hope is an affirmation of the world that God can make possible when we embrace God's vision for the world. But there were those who said, Isaiah, your vision doesn't make sense. And for those who said your vision doesn't make sense, Isaiah has a simple invitation. It is an invitation that Advent provides to us. The simple invitation is, let us walk in the light of the Lord. If you think that this dream is an impossibility, why not act as if it's so right now? If you think that there can't be peace, why not live in peace so that there can be peace? If you fear that the world is going to be lost, why not let it be lost and act as if though God has already done it? That's the invitation of Advent, to see the possibility, to see the world differently, to inaugurate what God has already promised right now. In the history and tradition of our faith, new hope arrived in the midst of oppression and domination. When a child was born, in Jesus we found God's love. In Jesus we found God's peace. In Jesus we found God's light. So during this season of Advent, we know already that things are not as they should be. We know that injustice and oppression distort our communities. We know that inequality and domination make it hard for people to live whole and complete lives. And yet we accept the invitation to Advent, to see beyond the brokenness, to see beyond the darkness, to see beyond the violence, and anticipate God doing something big and new, even when the evidence around us suggests that it is not so. Oh, you're looking at me like I said something crazy. There have been many people in our lifetimes who've given expression to that hope. I've been trying to figure out how to talk about it, but I'll just say it out. The one that you remember the "I Have a Dream" speech by Martin Luther King. If you don't know anything else about Martin Luther King, we know the "I Have a Dream" speech. This was a speech given on the March on Washington in 1963. And the world is quite familiar with it. And I just want to talk about this notion of hope, this hope in our lifetime. That hopeful speech that King gave that day was a great vision of a world of justice, of freedom for all God's children. He spoke about transforming our nation from a nation of injustice and discrimination to a land of freedom and justice. He talked about racial reconciliation in that speech. He talked about America letting freedom ring for all people. And many people do not realize it, but he had not planned to talk about his dream for America. That was not in the prepared text of that speech. As a matter of fact, his speech was a little languorous. It didn't have all of that poetry in it. And while he was speaking, the great gospel singer Mahalia Jackson kept screaming out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them." And he began to tell them about the dream. Now, one could say, "Oh my goodness, this is ridiculous. This doesn't sound like it's possible." There was nothing around him that suggested that any new possibility for people was there, that there was no breakthrough for justice on the horizon. Even as he spoke, the reality around him was unchanged. Less than a month after he gave this speech, less than a month after he spoke about little black children and white children playing together, 4 little girls were killed in a bombing in the 16th Street Baptist Church. The reality hadn't even changed. Less than a year after he gave that speech, a speech where he dreamed of Mississippi being transformed into an oasis of justice and freedom, 3 civil rights workers who were trying to register people to vote were killed in Neshoba County, Mississippi. Oh, your vision was futile. It's useless, Dr. King. Less than 2 years after he spoke on that mall saying that America should live out and would live out the true meaning of her creed, that all are created equal, Alabama state troopers violently ran down marchers on Edmund Pettus Bridge in what we know as Bloody Sunday. But here's the thing, what do we remember? We remember his dream. Even when it didn't seem possible, we remember that dream, because that minister of the gospel, and that's what he was, that minister of the gospel had a hope born not of prediction, but of Jesus' promise to us. That's the hope I'm talking about. That's the hope I'm trying to get us to take on during this season. The hope that says that our destiny is not in the hands of empire. Our destiny is in the hands of the God who said, I'm going to make it right. That's our destiny. It is the hope that comes in the prophecy that Isaiah gave when all of the available evidence didn't say it could be so, that there is coming a time. Oh, that prophecy is ours even to this day. Even when we know as much as we know, even as we think we've got the answers, we still live in that hope that there is coming a time when we will be in the very presence of God. There is coming a time when God's word and instruction will be the standard by which we all live our lives. There is coming a time when there will be peace and harmony among nations and people. And there is coming a time when God's light will overcome the darkness. That is our hope. The invitation of Advent is to see the world differently. Let's not accept what the world is telling us is so. Let us not wallow in fear or anxiety about what is going on around us. Let us accept this invitation right now to see the world, to live in the hope. Oh, I said earlier that hope can also be a burden. It can be. Because the evidence around us isn't always good. But hope is also a gift. To see God working when the rest of the world has given up. To see God moving in our very midst. To do what Isaiah told the people to do. To walk in the light of the Lord. Even when the rest of the world has sat down. The invitation. Accept it. Be inspired. Be inspired during the season by God's gift of hope.